You guys want another art history lesson real quick?
Not really.
Alright, let's do it. This is a tattered version of a painting called Dante and Virgil in Hell. It was painted by William Adolphi, some name with too many vowels in it, in 1850. It's another example of a real-life work of art that's found itself being represented in the Fallout franchise. And I think it's interesting that it's here, because in reality this painting is in a French museum, but in this game, it's right here. And there must be a reason for that. In my previous videos, we looked at real-life works of art that are in Fallout 4, and talked about how their content and context can be relevant to where the piece is placed within the game. And I think we were pretty successful, but ultimately you're the judge of that. But anyways, we're running it back with Fallout 3. So Dante and Virgil in Hell, I already talked about it a little bit in an older video when I was still using a crappy webcam, but I didn't really talk about it. One thing about old paintings like this is that they used to be another storytelling medium. So I figured we could use our analytical skills to try to figure out what that story is. Alright, so just by looking at it, I could tell we're in Pittsburgh. That's a given. The painting features Dante and Virgil. That must be these two guys. You might think it's these two guys, but something tells me our guys would be wearing clothes. It looks like they're watching an Irish vampire, they exist, I've seen Twilight, bite the shit out of... Is that Colin Farrell? So now we know this painting is the origin story of Colin Farrell's immortality. But now let's do some research and see how we did. This painting was inspired by a short scene from The Inferno, set in the 8th Circle of Hell. Alright, Pittsburgh, got that right. Dante, accompanied by Virgil, watches a fight between two damned souls. Cappuccino, a heretic and alchemist, is attacked and bitten on the neck by Giovanni Squingelli, who had usurped an identity of a dead man in order to fraudulently claim his inheritance. You win some, you lose some. But real quick, for anyone who might not know, Dante's Inferno is basically a really old version of A Christmas Carol. Except instead of being guided through Christmas past, present, and future, Dante, accompanied by Virgil, is guided through 9 levels of hell, all to help him understand that his life choices have consequences. So now you know. But let's look at this painting some more. Each character in the painting symbolizes something unique and serves a purpose to the story. Dante, the protagonist of the painting if you will, represents human emotion. He's looking at the damned souls almost with sorrow, fear, and maybe a little bit of pity, kind of like how Frodo would look at Gollum. Virgil is a representation of human reasoning. This mainly comes from Virgil being a real-life person from ancient Rome who was considered one of the greatest Roman poets. He was the ideal guy for Dante because he embodied the limitation of non-Christian human reasoning, since he was a pagan. But the main takeaway from this is representation of human reasoning. The two fighting Irishmen represent the violence and pandemonium that hell is. But what's interesting about these two guys is if you look real closely, their muscles are exaggerated and almost grotesque. Something done by the artist on purpose to make you and Dante share the same feeling of uneasiness. Because when you exaggerate the muscles like this, it makes them seem unnatural. And we have a tendency to not like things to look unnatural. It's the same reason you might find this kind of animation unsettling. I know I do. Then we have this devil guy flying around, but that's not the devil. This is the devil in the Inferno. But my understanding is that this guy represents the epitome of failure and loss of intellect since, the devil rebelled against God, and back then rebelling against God was like the dumbest thing you could do. But yeah, the devil is a devil just like a leg is a leg is a leg. But the last thing we need to understand about this painting is the setting. This particular scene takes place on the 8th level of hell. The 8th level of hell is called Male Bulge, and it's the level of hell reserved for liars and frauds. If you're familiar with Fallout 3, maybe you've already been making connections in your head. But if you haven't, don't worry because that's what we're gonna do next. I think the first reason that this painting is relevant to Fallout 3 comes from the Male Bulge part. Because if it weren't for lying and fraud, then the story of Fallout 3 never would have happened. Your father lies to you about being born in the vault, and because of his deceitfulness you need to run for your life. And because of your father's sins, you are thrown into a hellish wasteland full of evil trenches. Which is somehow what Male Bulge means. Another connection is that Dante, the protagonist of the painting, represents a human soul on the path of redemption and purity, just like the protagonist of Fallout 3. Hashtag Project Purity. But perhaps my favorite connection is when you compare the two paintings side by side. Because in the original we have characters to represent the human soul, human reasoning, sin and violence, and evil. All things that are unfortunately present in today's world. And in the Fallout painting, human reasoning is almost completely blacked out, leaving behind mainly sin and violence, while evil lingers on and human soul is almost faded away. I would call that a pretty accurate representation of the Fallout world. By the way, when I say sin, I don't mean things like eating meat on a Friday. I mean like murder and all those actually really bad things. So now the painting has turned from a story about human redemption into a story about the death of reasoning, leaving behind only chaos and violence. Sort of like what happened on October 23rd, 2077. Now you might be thinking, wow, you've spent so much time talking about painting you've already talked about. What's next? The Apotheosis of Washington? Yes, because there's a lot I didn't cover. One thing that I picked up about these classic grand paintings like this is that they took a really long time. And if you're going to spend the time to paint something in it, then it better be for a good reason. For example, the Apotheosis of Washington, painted by Constantino Brumidi in 1865, depicts George Washington surrounded by a bunch of Roman gods and a bunch of little details. Apotheosis pretty much just means ascending to godhood, so let's just get that out of the way. To his right is the goddess Victoria, victory, and to his left, Libertas, liberty. Liberty is wearing a red cap, which comes from an ancient Roman tradition when emancipated slaves were given a felt liberty cap. She is also holding a fasces, which is a symbol found throughout United States symbology, like on the Mercury dime, the House of Representatives, on the seal of the US Senate. At the time, it was meant to symbolize law and governance, but unfortunately, like a lot of other cool symbols, it was eventually adopted by fascist political movements. In this case, we're talking about Mussolini's National Fascist Party in Italy. But thankfully that meaning didn't stick around long enough, and for the most part it's still a fine symbol to use. For now. Anyways, the rest of the inner circle is made up of 13 maidens, each with a star above their head, each representing the original 13 colonies. You'll notice that some of them have their backs turned to Washington. That's said to represent the states that turned on the Union since this painting went up towards the end of the United States Civil War. The banner says, "Out of many, one," which is also on the United States seal, and it's meant to symbolize the unity of diverse people in a single country. The key word is diverse. I feel like a lot of people forget that these days. The outer circle has 6 scenes, each featuring a different Roman god and a major concept of the nation. First is the war scene, where Columbia, not a god, but instead an embodiment of the United States, is dressed as Bellona, a goddess of war, and her trusted companion, the eagle from the United States seal. Together they are trampling characters meant to represent tyranny and kingly power. Next is science with Minerva, the goddess of crafting and wisdom, with Benjamin Franklin as they try to figure out why the printer isn't printing even though they just put a new toner cartridge in. But really what they're doing has something to do with electrical generators or batteries or some shit that they just invented. This whole bit is about the importance of American innovation. Next we have the marine scene with Neptune and Venus. You might think that this scene would represent the prowess of the United States Navy or something, but literally what they're doing is laying cable. And no, that's not an innuendo. It's the transatlantic telegraph cable which runs from North America to Ireland, because back then that was about as close as we could get to England without it seeming like an act of war. Commerce. In the center we have Mercury. He's not wearing clothes because he's too fast for them. He's giving money to Robert Morris, the key financier for the American Revolution. You could argue that this scene represents capitalism in some ways because you see the money being handed to the already rich guy, instead of the guys actually doing the work. But what do I know? We can move on to mechanics, with Vulcan, the Roman god of the forge, and some other dudes putting together a cannon. They're making weapons, and as you could tell, he's the boss because he's the one not doing anything. And last is agriculture, with Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture. She's holding a cornucopia, a symbol of abundance in both harvest and spirituality. They're sitting on something called a reaper, which is used for harvesting grain crops. Here you can also see another Liberty cap from before, symbolizing the freedom the young Americans at the time will have the privilege of living in, as long as they're white. And finally the goddess Flora, just doing her thing, picking some flowers. So now that we know everything there is to know about the Apotheosis of Washington, we just have to do it again for the Fallout version. But don't worry, it won't take as long. So if we look at the Fallout version, you might notice that there's been some casualties. The scenes of the Apotheosis that survived the bombs are marine, commerce, mechanics, and agriculture. Each of the scenes left standing depicts a concept relative to Fallout 3, marine. The whole thing that the main story revolves around in this game is getting fresh water to the people of the capital wasteland. That one's given. Commerce. I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that this scene can also represent greed in some ways. And unfortunately, in a post-apocalyptic scenario, greed is equal to survival. In a world so stripped of basic resources, greed has become a natural, albeit savage, response to a lot of things. You gotta think of yourself before you can think of others. Mechanics. Crafting is a key concept in the Fallout franchise, whether we're talking about on a small player level scale of just making weapons in the game, or on a bigger scale of whoever can make the biggest, baddest weapon is in charge of the entire wasteland. Regardless, mechanics are smart.
Yeah.
And lastly, agriculture. This can be pretty obvious in the sense that agriculture is pretty limited yet crucial in a post-apocalyptic environment. But we could dig a bit deeper and find out that Ceres is also a goddess of motherhood. And all this started because Project Purity was your mother's idea, and her vision became the driving force behind your father's motivations, and eventually yours, if you made the right choices. The collapse of the war and science scenes is ironic because it was the advancements of both those things that led to the world ending the way it did. And the coup de grace is that the number one thing missing from the apotheosis of Washington is George Washington, ultimately symbolizing the death of the United States. And all that's left is a war-torn wasteland where people need to fight every day for food and water. And that's pretty crazy. So, like the last video, we're going to wrap this up by looking at a piece of art that was created post-apocalypse. And where are we going to do that? Pittsburgh. On our way to entering Haven in the Pit, which is based on the Cathedral of Learning in Pittsburgh, there's this shackled up wooden statue. It being made of wood is interesting enough, but we'll get to that in a bit. According to the wiki, this statue was inspired by a Wicker Man statue that the lead artist, Nathan Perkypile, saw when he attended the Burning Man festival. The Wicker Man, made famous by Christopher Lee in 1973, and again by Nicolas Cage in 2006, is based on an ancient Celtic pagan ritual where druids would sacrifice humans and animals by burning them in a wicker statue. The goal of this was to ensure a bountiful harvest. Whether or not it worked, I don't know, I wasn't there. But in terms of this Fallout context, I get it. Yeah, it makes for an intimidating archway thing to walk under on your way to meet the Lord of the Pit, but its symbolism is there too. The Wicker Man is a symbol of sacrifice. And what is Asher doing? He's sacrificing people via slave labor in order to attempt to make sure that Pittsburgh is bountiful again. And if you look closer, there's a dead body inside the statue, which is pretty messed up. But then again, everything about the pit is pretty messed up.
You remember me, don't you, Billy?
And you would think that in a city known for steel, that their version of this statue would also be made of steel. But wood was the chosen material. Now this just might be for sake of consistency since it is a Wicker Man after all, but it could also be a choice because wood is the more temporary of the two materials. It could speak to the fact that Asher is always talking about how slavery is temporary for the pit, and he intends to free everyone once his wife develops a cure for radiation. But I guess we'll just have to wait to see how that goes. And I'm not condoning Asher's actions here, even though I did side with him in the DLC.
A wise decision, New Blood.
Look, I could have eaten the baby, alright? Get off my back. So there's your final art history lesson.
Thank God.
Let me know what your favorite bit was. Mine was the apotheosis of Washington, because it had absolutely no business being in this game. If you look up in the Capitol building, it's just another damaged and smudged up roof. You can't even make out that it's there unless you use console commands. But when I saw that someone actually took the time to put this in the game, I absolutely lost my shit. And I've been chasing that high ever since. But that's it. Let me know if there's anything else you think I should look into. If not, then, I don't know, subscribe I guess. I could always use more of those. But in the meantime, look at art, study history, take care of yourself. Adios.